Sorry, I was
12:03.
listening to delayed audio. Like,
I'm like, we have to go. Okay.
we're good.
All right, everyone, we're going to get started. So how many of you are here for the first time? Oh, fantastic. Okay, great. So if you haven't been here before, Lunchalytics is something that we have run in Edmonton for 4 years, and Darkhorse is the founding kind of sponsor of that. And there was a request about a year ago to start coming to Calgary. And really the point of these events is to introduce you to pretty cool things that are happening kind of in the community of data science around different industries and give you a chance to network as well. And that's really our goal in having these here. So we want to thank the sponsors for today, which is us as the founding sponsor, and then ATB is actually our major sponsor for Calgary. And we're always looking for more sponsorship. That's how the lunch is free, that you get to eat every day, every time you come. And so if you want to help us out, that would be great. The other thing too is that if you can't make it any of the times, it's always going to be on the first Tuesday of the month in this space, at least until June, and then we'll figure out what happens after that. But if you can't make it, we do live stream the event, and it's on our YouTube channel, so you can check it out there as well. So this month we're talking about visualization. And last time when I was here, people were like, well, what's visualization? Is just making everything look pretty? And it is kind of that, but it's also, we spend a lot of time figuring out how users interact with websites or what information they're looking for, or really just how to show the information in a way that's clear and easy to understand. And we also figure out how much the user is going to engage with it and how we're going to help them do that. So there's a lot of steps in visualization, and we have two speakers today who will talk about that. We have Wesley Willet, who is with the U of C, and he leads the Data Experience Lab, and then we have Dan Haight, who is the president of Darkhorse. So without any further delay, I'm going to transfer it over to you.
Excellent. Cool. Thanks a lot. So I'm at the U of C. I wear a couple of different hats there. So I'm part of the computer science department, the computational media design program, and then also a piece of the new data science program that we've been launching over the course of the last year with undergraduate, minor, and then also professional programs. So happy to talk about that if folks are interested. And then on the research side, I'm part of the Interactions Lab, which is the human-computer interaction and visualization collective at the U of C. And then I also lead the Data Experience Lab, which is this lovely set of postdocs, PhD, master's students, and undergrads. And most of our work is really at this intersection of visualization, social computing, and interaction design, and at a bunch of sort of sub-areas that emerge at that intersection. So things like citizen science, crowdsourcing, and personal informatics. And increasingly, we've also really been pushing in sort of a broader space around that, thinking about embedded and immersive experiences with data. And that means a whole bunch of different things. It includes work on word scale visualizations, thinking about how you can make documents that embed data in more dynamic ways, building tools for touch and VR interactions with maps. We've done a bunch of work thinking about how you can leverage the existing interactions you do with a tablet or a phone to communicate depth information more richly. And we've also done a bunch of work in the last couple of years thinking about interfaces for interacting with data in VR and what the affordances of those sorts of tools might look like in the future. But the main thing I wanted to talk about today is a project we've been working on over the course of the last couple of years that's really focusing on how we can use visualizations as a tool to make open data more accessible. And this, I think, is one of the really big challenges of our current era for governments and for other large institutions, right? So governments and large public institutions generate lots of data, but currently there aren't a lot of tools out there for citizens to use to dig into that data and understand it. And there's a challenge here where this really starts to limit citizen understanding of some of this data and also reduce the potential for that open data to drive accountability. So we actually have a really promising push over the last decade or so to create open data portals. The Open Canadian one is a great example of this. And the challenge is that most of the data on those portals still looks more or less like this, right? Still big dumps of CSVs and PDFs that are relatively difficult to access without more analytical skill. And I think most of us can agree that open data shouldn't just mean this. Obviously, publishing all of this data is a really big piece, but from a public advocacy and transparency perspective, it's probably not enough to really make this data accessible. So we've been really trying to explore how governments might be able to help make this data more accessible by visualizing it, and by visualizing it in ways that are maybe a bit more creative than just using standard off-the-shelf analysis tools. And we've done this mostly in the context of a collaboration with the National Energy Board. which is convenient since they're located a few blocks that way across the tracks. And it's nice to always be working with a local partner. It's also a really interesting mix because our group at the U of C is one of the few groups that's working in the visualization space in a way that's really focused on interaction design for visualization and also on data literacy and data democratization. So we actually have a bunch of work over the course of the last few years between my group and also Dr. Sheila Carpendale's group, thinking about how to use visualizations for public engagement. This is one that's looking at visualizing data around HIV and AIDS awareness within Canada and using this as a jumping off point for public conversations. We've also looked at how visualizations can support things like serendipitous awareness and browsing in library environments. Looked at how you can support shared public discussion and problem solving around big data sets. And also looked at sort of visual tools for supporting citizen scientists and using that visualization as a way to bootstrap them into doing richer data analysis. So building off all of that, we actually put together a team a couple of years ago, this set of folks, to try to look at visualization as an opportunity for encouraging more discussion around open public data and thinking about the value of that open data for public institutions. So I wanted to spend most of the time today just showing you a couple of examples of the visualizations that we've built with the NEB and try to give a sense for how we've thought about designing them and where we think some of the benefits come both from a public standpoint and from the institutions that we're designing for. So we started this project about 3 years ago, and we started working with folks at the NEB to try to actually build some visualizations that would parallel the content from their energy futures reports, which they put out on a regular basis, and provide their projections for future energy production and consumption across Canada under a bunch of different scenarios. So this tool, which you're welcome to check out, all of these are live on the web. This one allows you to interactively explore the NEB's projections for Canadian energy use over the course of the next 3 decades or so, and look at this across a bunch of different sectors and also different hypothetical scenarios for future development. And I think it's a really sort of interesting first stab. This was our kind of first test pilot for projects in this space, with us doing the design work and then VisWorks, who's also based here in Calgary, doing the low-level implementation of the final prototypes. Based off of the success of that, we then moved on to a second project, which I'll spend most of my time talking about because I think it's sort of a nice illustration of the whole cross-section of our process. And that's thinking about visualizing pipeline incidents. And thinking specifically about incidents on Canadian pipelines. This is obviously an Alaskan one, because ours tend to be not quite as visible. But this is an interesting one in particular because it's sort of a challenging public data set, right? The NEB has made public all of their reporting on pipeline incidents over the course of the last 30 or 40 years. But it's something that's definitely of a lot of interest to the public at this point. And it's tightly connected to a lot of contemporary political issues, which make it an interesting but challenging one for a government agency to actually make public. So the NEB regulates about 73,000 kilometers of pipeline across Canada, and they regulate most of the pipelines that cross provincial boundaries, international boundaries, as well as other snippets of pipeline throughout the provinces. Actually, the AER regulates far more in terms of overall pipeline length, but the NEB operates most of the big pipelines that you would think of if you're thinking about the public discussion around them. And then they're obviously involved in the processing of applications for new ones, which is also a big sort of political issue. And then there's the incidents themselves, right? So there's about 100 or so incidents per year handled by NEB inspectors on pipelines that they regulate. These range from anything from releases of substance, which could be small or large, all the way up to things like fires or explosions or loss of life, which actually end up being pretty infrequent on these pipelines. Because this is such an interesting but somewhat controversial data set, we were really encouraged by the commitment from the NEB leadership to try to make this one of the first visualizations that we worked with as part of the project, because I think it's a really interesting one for folks outside of the organization. And so our goal really was to take this data and try to not just make it releasable, but also accessible. And so we tried to do that by working with specialists at the NEB to try to build an understanding of that data ourselves, and then go through an iterative design process to try to build a visualization tool that was general purpose and accessible but still powerful. So as part of that, we actually spent a little bit of time digging back into the archives and looking at just how this data has been collected over the course of the last 10 or 15 years, and even going back a little bit further. So we can go all the way back actually even to the 60s and 70s and see this data collected on paper in ledgers. And part of the challenge here is that this data is actually not one consistent data set, right? Like any big government data set, you actually have years and years and years of different records with different schemas, and it's actually pretty challenging just from that perspective. So ultimately, we focused on looking at just the last decade's worth of data and then working iteratively with some of the internal data experts at the NEB to do some initial rounds of iterative sketching and design over the course of a series of workshops, and then trying to distill an understanding of the data for ourselves. This is a little bit tricky because for any given incident, there's actually a lot of data here. We're talking about 100 different pieces of information per incident, some of which are fairly easy to understand and some of which are pretty obscure. That includes things like the location and the date and information about what happened, but also really technical information about system components that might be much more challenging to report. So what we ended up doing is focusing in on a subset of these and then doing a bunch of rounds of iterative design to try to hone in on a possible solution for it. What we ended up with is this visualization, which again is publicly accessible, and I'll show all of the URLs for these at the end of the talk as well if you don't catch them now. But this is another visualization, again, designed by us and then implemented by the folks at VisWorks that I think does some pretty interesting things. So it's a visualization of a little over 1,000 incidents covering a period from 2008 up to now, at this point, 2019. At this point, I think it's about 11,000 or so incidents that are recorded. And then we focused on 14 pieces of information that are the most sort of crucial and also the most complete across the data set. So the visualization that we built uses something that researchers usually call parallel sets. So each one of these columns shows all 1,000+ values in the data set and shows one piece of information about them. So if you see the column on the left, you actually see how many incidents occurred per year over that 10 or 11 year span. On the right-hand side, you can see how many incidents occurred in each category. So how many were releases of substance, how many were fires. Down at the very bottom, if you were to hover over it, you'd see a very, very small number of injuries to people. And then you could also interactively browse these to get a sense of how many of each one of these incident types occurred in any given year, for any given incident type, what years they tend to be more or less common in. And then you can also combine this with other interactive views like maps. And the goal here was to try to create not just one visualization, but instead a visualization system that would allow you to actually create a whole bunch of different views that allow you to inspect different aspects of the data and also tell different stories. And so the goal here was to create something that's an interactive tool for exploring data, but also potentially a storytelling platform that could be used both by data experts at the NEB, but also by members of the public to dig into this data set and actually explore incidents that are relevant to them or tell stories. It's something that we also tried to make easy to share on social media. This has been true for all of these. So it's possible for the NEB to use them in their social media feeds and link back to individual specific views. It's also possible for any member of the public to do that. And so the highest level, the hope is that these visualizations give members of the public a more readily accessible tool for just understanding where and how these incidents happen. So if you want, you can generate views very quickly that focus in on just, say, a subset of the data. For example, looking just at 2016 and, say, just releases of substance or fires, and you can start to get a sense of where in the country they happen. You could also build views that focus on things like, say, just construction, and now start to understand where construction was actually happening over the course of the last 10 years on these pipelines, and what kinds of incidents might be associated with construction as opposed to operation. And the goal here really is to encourage public dialogue that's grounded in data. So if I, for example, am a member of the public who's interested in understanding an incident at an NEB-regulated facility, so something like this amine link at a BC gas plant in 2015, you could actually pretty quickly generate a view that shows all the characteristics of that particular incident, and then explore to understand how representative this kind of incident might be, how common it might be, what other incidents like it might have looked like. So I think this has been a pretty interesting project and has been sort of a nice illustration of how we can create something that's a little bit more accessible and a little bit more playful around this data set. We've also done a few more projects in the last year. This one, which is also up as of about 6 or 9 months ago, is showcasing energy imports and exports from Canada using the NAB's data that's collected on this. So we have some really interesting data sets here looking at electricity imports and exports. They reveal some things that are maybe a little bit surprising. The fact that actually BC exports electricity as far away as Texas. And there's some interesting connectivity questions with the Canadian grid, which means that a lot of the Canadian provinces are actually more connected to their neighbors to the south than they are laterally across the country, which is pretty interesting. Also visualizations of crude oil imports and exports, looking at traffic in and out of the states, and then also looking at things like the amount of natural gas and oil that's transiting across the border at specific ports of entry. And this is pretty interesting to give a sense of things like the overall change in the import and export market with the states over the course of the last 10 years. Also interesting because it gives a sense of some of the quirks of the regulatory process as well, right? So one of the really big takeaways from this visualization, if you're a member of the public, is that there's confidentiality rules in place that actually prevent the government from releasing an awful lot of the data that would make up this data set, which from a transparency perspective is maybe a little bit problematic, but this actually provides a way of seeing that where you wouldn't necessarily have, even if you had opened up any of the existing data sets that are published publicly. And then ongoing work we're tackling is probably the most challenging of these projects at all, and that's because we're trying to visualize information about the really large corpus of conditions that are being placed on any new public pipeline construction. And so this is actually a corpus of thousands of legal documents, which in comparison to the other data sets is much more challenging to think about visualizing. It's currently accessible via a web interface that makes it pretty challenging to actually find any individual condition or order from the NEB. And so what we're working on coming in next year is an interface that's actually much more playful, that tries to make it possible to very quickly find the sets of conditions and the pipelines that where conditions are being put in place around any particular issue, and still provide access back to the raw text. So this is something that's actively in development, and I think we'll have a version of it live at some point, probably in the next couple of months. BizWorks is sort of at the point where they have a fairly working live prototype now, and we're slated for some launch at some point during the summer. So all of these I think are really interesting because they're providing a lens for the public to look at this data, but they're also providing these institutions a lens to look at their own data practices and data governance. Working with the NEB has been really interesting because they have been able to use their interactions with us to think a lot about the quality of these data sets and how they're reported. Our work on the Pipeline Incidents Project actually triggered a really big revision to the way that they report these that removed a lot of jargon, which I think was very helpful in terms of legibility. And it's also helped them think about how they're actually going to maintain and serve these data sets going forward. Now, the tricky part about this is that obviously making data accessible and truly accessible isn't easy. There's a lot of practical and institutional barriers, things like confidentiality laws or just the practical difficulty of surfacing data sets that can make this challenging. And there's a lot of practical limitations in terms of visualization creation as well, right? Each of these were fairly involved longer term projects, building pretty bespoke visualizations, and clearly that's not practical for all data sets. But at the same time, it's very hard to build a one-size-fits-all data visualization that would work for all public data. And then there are issues like vision impairment and data literacy more broadly that make even more accessible visualizations still potentially problematic for some slice of the public. But I think we're just getting started here. I think this work really showcases some of the possible value of open data visualizations for governments and other large institutions. And I think that we're starting to explore this in these, how these kinds of institutions can build the capacity to do this kind of visualization work themselves. The NEB, in parallel to this, has actually been building out a whole team to do this sort of work on an ongoing basis internally. I think that'll be really helpful. And then one more really quick thing. So again, I'll pop these up again in a second. But one other thing that I do want to pitch and announce while I'm here is, so I'm really proud to also, in addition to all the things I'm doing at the UFC, be one of the general chairs for IEEE Viz, which is the biggest academic visualization venue And so this year, we're actually going to be bringing it to Canada for the first time in its 30-year history, which should be great. So we'll be doing this in October in Vancouver. It's a 5-day event with usually an academic program of a couple hundred papers, but also a bunch of opportunities for engagement with industry as well. So for this year, there's going to be the same sort of paper track, but also a bunch of opportunities to attend workshops, panels, tutorials, and then also a bunch of events that we've been building over the course of the last few years that are tailored towards practitioners. So that includes things like our Viz in Practice series. There'll be a bunch of application spotlights this year that are focusing on applications of Viz to particular industries, and things like the Viz Job Fair. So just a little nudge to everyone here, if you're really interested in Viz and visual analytics, consider attending, consider thinking about presenting. The Viz in Practice venues are really tailored to actually presenting visualization and analysis work that's being done in industry rather than in academia. And consider supporting if you're thinking about attending and thinking about trying to recruit people in this space. So yeah, happy to answer any questions and talk about any of these topics.
So I just have a question. I'm sure this whole process was a long journey, and the initial stage was probably making sure that the data you have is analysis friendly. The data that wasn't analysis friendly, how was that journey like? What kind of tools did you guys use? What happened? Any challenges? And some of the notebooks that you guys showed from data from the 1970s, etc. How did you guys take that into account? Did you guys use technologies like OCR to maybe, pull up the words and make it more accessible? How was that journey like?
Yeah, so the question is sort of what is the journey from actually getting the initial data to being able to think about designing the visualizations, especially for the older data. For things like the older notebooks, those by and large mostly have been translated into some newer data formats. And so we didn't actually need to think about doing any OCR. Those, for the most part, have actually been manually transcribed into more recent data structures by employees. The big challenge for us is that the data is really incomplete for a lot of those earlier points and just covers a much, much smaller range of categories, and also those categories end up being mapped in really weird ways. So for us, it was much easier to think about focusing just on the last 15 years or so of data, which are more complete, and where there are some issues around things like French translation that we just couldn't resolve for some of the older data. Once we actually have it, that's still a really big piece of the process. There's this rule of thumb for visualization design, but also lots of people talk about this in analytics too, right? Where data wrangling is actually 2/3 or 3/4 of your work. There's definitely an element of that for every project that we do. And so very often what we're doing initially is actually jumping in and using end user analysis tools, things like Tableau, actually writing out code in Jupyter Notebooks, and trying to do some initial data analysis and data characterization there that allows us to then turn around and start to think about what a reasonable design is. And at that point, we usually turn back to sketching, usually with subsets of the data, to do some of the initial design work. And then we do a real mix of prototyping, interactive prototypes, and designing, using in some cases still graphic design tools to build some of the things that just aren't possible to build in existing platforms. Yeah?
For something like the NEB project, there's obviously a huge sort of back-end component to the data viz. Did you guys develop that yourselves? Did you have a team working with you on their side, or how did that come together? And how does it typically come together for you?
Yeah, so the question is about how we manage the sort of back-end component of these visualizations. This is one where, for the purpose of these projects, we've tried to make sure that we are focusing mostly on the front-end piece, which means that from the very beginning, we've had an ongoing discussion about how to sort of segment the back-end piece so that we're able to sort of do the front-end work without having to deal with it as well. Because also as an academic lab, we don't necessarily have the resources and infrastructure to do that long-term. In practice, what's happened here is it's been a mix of internal data teams at the NEB, sort of extracting and pulling the initial slices of data, helping us parse them. And then the team at VizWorks, who's building the front-end visualizations after the design is done, has also been working with them throughout the process to build ETL processes that deliver that data from their databases to the visualizations. And so that's something that's mostly been scoped as a project for the development team, but with input from both sides all the way through. And so it's an ongoing discussion, especially as the visualization designs evolve.
Cool, thanks.
A couple more questions?
Yeah.
How do projects like this usually come about? Like, do you find the projects or do they find you?
Yeah, the question is, yeah, how do we usually find these projects? I mean, as academics, for the most part, we are sort of having the projects come to us. There's a really large number of folks with interesting data sets, and so in some ways we actually end up having to be kind of picky in terms of the data sets we choose, just because there's only a finite number of graduate students and a finite number of advising hours. And especially if we want to build something that's sort of a larger scale project like this, this series of 4 or 5 visualizations has been an ongoing process over the course of 2 years with a team of usually about 5 or 6 people in our lab. And that includes postdocs who are doing a little bit more research, but also people who are in sort of full-time design positions. And so that means that usually we're having discussions with folks who think they have really interesting data sets where we might be able to weigh in and also do some interesting research along the way. And then ultimately try figuring out which ones are the best fit given the resources and time that we have. So usually it's coming from the outside rather than us sort of going out and soliciting data sets.
One more question?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I rarely find people are open to discovering. They usually have a confirmation bias going into whatever it is they're trying to explore more of. So pipeline incidents would be one of them. Did you factor that in as part of the design around what that experience would be, to say, oh, actually, we might take them places where they, didn't want to go, but they're going to get it all anyways. I'm just interested in sort of the visualization and sort of the behavioral side of it.
Yeah, so the question is how do you deal with things like the potential for confirmation bias when you're designing something for a general audience? It's definitely challenging. I mean, I think we are mostly thinking about this from the perspective of providing guidance so that people understand at least how to read the visualizations correctly, and then also thinking about it as a tool that can be used to support broader conversations. So if you jump in and you create a view that reflects some pre-existing notion that you have about this data set, at least you could share that view and someone else can jump back into the visualization from that point and create a view that maybe combats that perspective or recontextualizes it. And so most of our focus there has been providing links direct back into the visualization so that if somebody else wants to continue that conversation, they can continue from the same point. That means that basically all of these visualizations are designed with stateful URLs. So if I copy a link from this and paste it into Facebook or paste it into Twitter, somebody's not going to get back to just the home page for the visualization, but they're going to get back to that exact view. And that's helpful, especially because you could also imagine if an institution was willing to actually sort of step out into the public sphere and have these kinds of conversations on social media, you can think about doing that too. Currently, someone like the NEB isn't really positioned to do that, either from a resource perspective or from a legal perspective. But you could imagine actually having conversations grounded in these data sets and in these visualizations.
So what if I wanted, as a citizen person, to download the data and do my own in whatever tool I choose to? Can I do that through your portal?
Definitely, yeah. So the question is about actually downloading the open data. Yeah, so for every single one of these, we're trying to provide links on the visualization page itself to pull the full data that we're using to drive the visualization. And so in most cases, there's a download button right on the main page that pulls the entire subset. For the upcoming ones where we're doing all of the conditions, that's not really practical. And so we're going to have links for downloading subsets of them, sort of on a per company or per condition basis, because the actual data sets are these entire collections of legal documents. And it's a collection that's evolving pretty rapidly. And so there's not sort of a single download link for the whole thing because it's actually gigabytes of data and gigabytes of documents. So instead, the functionality is going to be focused around downloading the subsets that you're focused on right now in the current view. For all the other ones that are up right now, there's a download link that allows you to pull the entire up-to-date data set.
I'm going to cut it off, actually. Do you mind just meeting with him after? Okay. So
Yeah, I'm totally happy to chat afterwards.
Yeah, we always ask the speakers to stay for the last 10 minutes, but people, it's lunchtime, and so we keep us moving forward. So thank you, Wesley, for that presentation.
Excellent.
So as we transition to the next speaker, a couple of things we do as a community service here. Who's looking for a job? Okay, and then who's hiring data scientists? Anybody? Nobody, not today. Sometimes we do. So sometimes we try to partner you up. We do have a job board on the Lunchalytics website, so if you want to go there, we do post jobs when people send them to us. So that's always a service that we would like to provide. The other thing too is because it's kind of new in Calgary, this is our third Lunchalytics. So we did the first one, I can't remember. The first one was on, what was the first one on? The second one was on machine learning. I remember that much. Hockey analytics, yeah, and then machine learning, Viz. The next one we're planning to do is energy-based, and then the last one we're going to do is on HR, kind of workplace analytics, which I think is really interesting too. And so we do try to plan these out in advance. If you have any speakers that you'd like to suggest, or you yourself would like to speak, if you have something you'd like to present, then definitely let us know, because we are Edmonton-based and we just come in and out for the day. And so you guys are the community that's here, so it'd be nice to kind of hear from you guys on what you want to see from a topic, as well as what you want to see in terms of speakers. So that would be really helpful for us. And you're ready to go with your 2 mics? All right, so Dan Haight from Darkhorse Analytics, and he's going to be talking about a tool we built called the Opportunity Atlas.
Thank you, Carmen, and thank you all for coming. We're good to go, Greg? Okay, so first though, I want to talk just a little bit of theory, and I want to talk about 2 things, clarity and engagement. Now, we're an analytics company, and I always tell my team, getting the right answer is half the battle. Convincing someone that it's the right answer is the other half of the battle. Visualization is one of the key tools that we have in our arsenal to convince and to communicate. And one of the tools I'm going to show here at the end is an interactive exploration tool. And I'll get into that in a moment. But on the one hand, we have, I'll plug this in, we have clarity, right? Clarity is when you look at a visualization and you just say, oh, I get it, that makes sense. You just get it. And that should be something we strive for, right? When we create a visualization, it's clear. On the other hand, we have, uh-oh. No, it's coming, it's coming. Shift. Okay. Go away. Engagement, right? That's the part that makes you want to share it on Facebook. Like, oh, so cool. Let me show my friends this. Okay? So I'm going to show this as a continuum to start with. So you can either choose, I'm going to create a visual that's really clear, or I'm going to create a visual that's really engaging. So here's something that's really clear, right? It's just a table of numbers. On-time delivery improved by 24%, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? That's clear. That's probably as clear as we could get, but it's pretty boring. Let's be clear about that. All right? So I'm going to put it on the continuum. There it is. High clarity. Really bad on the engagement side, obviously. It's about as far over as we can get. Let me just move that mouse. All right. And then we have Jimi Hendrix, the Experience Live, which is incredibly engaging. Look at this. There's color, there's lines, there's maps, there's all kinds of things. And if you go online, you can hover over things and things will happen, right? This is super engaging, but what does it tell me? I don't know, right? Super engaging, not really clear. So we think to ourselves, it must be a trade-off. Or does it have to be? No. What if it's not a continuum? What if instead it's an efficient frontier that you can choose to be anywhere inside that pie-shaped area where you could be really engaging and really clear. Now, if you want to be super duper duper engaging, maybe you can't be really that clear. And vice versa. If you want to be just incredibly clear, you can't put a lot of engagement sauce into it, right? Okay? But now we can place things on this thing, this chart I've created here, and my goal is to be as close to that orange line as possible. I want to be as engaging as possible while still being as clear as possible. And if I'm weighing these off against each other, it's not just a one-to-one, okay? So let's go for 2 quick examples. Here we have Breathing City. This is created by my colleague Joey. It's showing where people work in New York City. So orange means where I'm working, and blue means where I'm sleeping, when I'm at home. So we can see there's Central Park, that big rectangle in the middle. We can see Midtown and Uptown and the different hours of the day, and oh, there's the university turning off and on. So we're looking at this. It's engaging. I think more than 1 million people have downloaded this. But it's not really clear. I can't tell a lot about it. I have to look at it for a while to kind of see patterns and so forth. So I'm going to put that over here. Yeah, really engaging, not that clear, but it's on the frontier because I like it. Now here's another one. This one's fascinating. Now, once I tell you what this is, you're going to get it. You think it's a mustache, but this is a person pushing a bicycle 800 times with no one on it and seeing what happens. It starts on the left and it tips over, and then it tips over the other way. And every time you push it, sometimes it zigzags back and forth and makes it all the way to the right side of the page, right? But that's really cool, isn't it? This is really engaging and it's really clear. I can see, yeah, most often my bike is going to crash somewhere around there. Okay? So this, I'm going to give it a score right there, right on the frontier. That's good news. The closer to that orange line, the better off I am. Clear and engaging. Now let's look at another example. Here we have something just pulled randomly from the internet. Man. Shouldn't this add up to 100%? Really? Okay, I give this guy a bad score. Okay, I'm going to say, okay, you had some color, I'll give you a little bit of engagement, maybe 2 out of 5, 1.5. Clarity, I really don't know what that meant. Now we have the venerable pie chart. What are your most favorite types of pie? Okay, that's pretty engaging. I'm hungry, so I'm going to pay attention to this. I give it a better score, but it's not on the orange line. We want it to be on the orange line. Okay, so there, that's my theory for the day. No, not quite. I'll talk about it a little more. How can you make things more clear? So there's this idea invented by, I don't know if it was invented by Stephen Few or Edward Tufte, and they talk about the data ink ratio. So how many pixels are devoted to the data and how many are devoted to the other things? Some of you may have seen these. When we improve that, it's all about taking pixels away. So you start with your ugly Excel chart with lots of 3D and wood grain and all the rest, and then you just get rid of things. This is how you make it more clear. You actually make it more better as well. So we're using just a couple colors because we just want to emphasize 1 or 2 things. We're lightening up all the ink that's devoted to things that are extraneous. All right? So we start with that ugly thing. We start getting rid of even the grid lines. Do we even need the x-axis? No. We direct label. So we started out with this ugly 3D chart that we thought was cool and engaging, and it wasn't. Okay, so we started with that and we work our way to the beautiful. We can do the same thing with data tables because that's still visualization. The Excel default, man, it puts the data in jail behind those grid lines. We got all kinds of precision that we have no justification for, right? All those extra decimals, why are we wasting them? Okay, so we're going to left align the text and we're going to right align the numbers and we're going to line up the titles appropriately. We got rid of all that bolding that's extraneous. And the way our minds work, we can't compare big numbers like this together. Our minds work in kind of 3-digit chunks at most, it would seem. So wind it all up, use the white space, a little bit of color for effect. And wow, it's just zen-like, is it not? Does that not feel good? Now my last one, let's do the same thing with the pie chart. So we start with the usual 3D pie chart. Everyone loves those. And we just start cutting things. We get rid of the borders. We get rid of the boldness. Right? If we bold everything, we bolded nothing. And then we get rid of the 3D. Why would we waste that dimension? Come on. And we're going to reduce the colors, right? Just 1 or 2 colors for emphasis. We're going to get rid of those wedges. And then we're going to fatten up those lines. And huzzah, we have fixed the pie chart. All right? So the answer is you have 3 pie charts to use in your life. Use them wisely. Anything you can show with a pie chart, you can show better with that bar chart. Not entirely true. If it's a Pac-Man, meaning one thing compared to the whole, then a pie chart makes sense. But usually you're comparing pieces to pieces when you're doing a pie chart. And we are way better at seeing distance than we are calculating area. I think it goes back to our early man days when, I'd look across the forest and I'd see the guy and I'd be like, oh, he's got an inch on me, right? We're good at telling height. If we have to fight him, we got to know if he's got the reach, okay? That's my theory. So, how do you make things more engaging? Now there's no easy answer to this. This is why you need people like Wesley and his research lab. It's art. It's creativity meeting science together. And here's just a little example. How can I make this better? Here's my first cut at it. Make it big, right? wow them with big numbers. But that's not enough. There's more to this. And the whole science of data visualization, I think, is really about making things engaging, but not forgetting about the clarity. Okay? So I'm going to give you an example now, and this is the question we were posed with. A research group out of the States, the lead researcher was Raj Chetty. Apparently he's very famous. And he's come up with a measurement of upward mobility for Americans and tied to your location, tied to place that you were born. And it's actually fascinating how he's able to tease out the numbers. So you imagine a family that lives in a poor neighborhood. The government looks upon them and says, we must help this family. So they gave them vouchers and they said, go ahead and move somewhere else. We'll pay for your rent to move and your moving expenses. And so this happened in the Clinton administration. They moved thousands of families all over in different parts of the US to better neighborhoods. And then 5 or 10 years later, they started evaluating and they said, man, it didn't improve their income at all. Let's cancel the program. So they stopped doing it. And this researcher, Dr. Chetty, went back and he looked at the data and said, maybe it didn't affect the parents, but what impact did it have on the children? And he looked and he said, kids who spent 5 years living in a bad neighborhood were better off than the kids who spent 10 years living in that same neighborhood. And they looked at sibling pairs. One brother was born in the bad neighborhood. One brother, only lived there for the, 2 years of his childhood. And they compared the two and they're like, oh my goodness, the badness of that neighborhood sticks. It goes with you when you move. And sure enough, there are neighborhoods, for whatever reason, and there are a number of reasons, are just bad and have a continuing bad impact 20 or 30 years hence. So let's look at a tool. The problem was, when you start looking at the entire US, you end up with a lot of data. In fact, about 200 million. Oh, why is it giving me that? Okay, so here's the Opportunity Atlas. So you can see this, you can play with it yourself. Let me make it full screen. At opportunityatlas.org. So we are looking at every census tract in the US, and we're going to explore the opportunity associated with that census tract. So notice we have a little on-ramp to help people get started. Hey, number one, you can search for a city, and most people just type in where their hometown was and say, hey, is it sticking with me still? You can look at what? You can look at an outcome in particular. You can look at rent, job growth, incarceration rate, and other things, as well as this really particular metric called opportunity. And you can look at who. You can say, I'm interested in Asian females who grew up in low-income families. What is the impact on them? Because it differs by gender, by race, and etc. So, thank you. Now I have the instructions, but I'm overwhelmed, right? Okay, so I go to this map and I start zooming in and I type in Dallas, okay, Dallas, Texas, and it zooms me into Dallas, and now it starts pulling up all this data, and wow, I can see that the south part of Dallas has bad opportunities, meaning if I grow up there, it's not so good, especially if I'm from a low-income family. What if I'm from low-income Hispanic families? Is it the same? The picture changes a bit. I click on neighborhoods. So what I'm doing right now is what few people will actually do. The New York Times discovered this in their upshot data journalism, is that people don't interact with visualizations like this. It's very difficult to get them to interact with this. And so they build a lot more animations in their data journalism, because it's scary to try to interact with data like this at this level. So how can you make it more accessible? So I'm glad you asked. One way you can do that is you can pre-find stories for them, and you can spoon feed people these stories and allow them to get comfortable with the tool. So here we have an interesting one. If I click on these little icons, it's going to show me the urban-rural divide, and all I have to do is scroll. So is upward mobility better in the country or better in the cities? Any votes? Who thinks it's the country? Who thinks it's the city? Well, let's find out. Let's see, in rural Iowa, wow, look at that. The cities are kind of reddish. The country is all that nice blue-green. So in eastern Iowa, high levels of upward mobility in rural areas, but in urban centers, not so good. Even similar backgrounds. Okay? But now the map zooms over to North Carolina, and the opposite's true. Rural areas in North Carolina are bad to be born in. And you're better off to be born in the city. The upward mobility in the city is way different. So it isn't just, city good, country bad, or vice versa. It really depends on the location. And then it illustrates some, what are the structural reasons why? What's happening there? Is it friendships? Is it nutrition? Who knows? So let's look at some more stories. So here's an interesting one. Let's look at Los Angeles, because we all saw those gang movies, right? So central LA, lots of crime for decades, okay? Yet children raised in poor families of the same race and gender in different neighborhoods with identical kind of poverty rates as we traditionally understand them have very different outcomes. Let's look. So we go to, we switch to advanced mode where we have a whole bunch more things. Notice a lot of things were hidden along the left. Now there's more things. And I'm showing them that, okay? So wait, what was the, see that now we're going down to children born in the lowest 1%, okay? In Watts, home of the Nickerson Gardens Public Housing Project, black men raised in the lowest income families can expect to earn about $6,000 when they turn 30. That's their annual income. That's nasty, right? That's $3 an hour if you worked full time, okay? That's in your mid-30s. Whereas black men, among these black men, now I just changed metrics on the left. So instead of looking at household income, now I'm looking at incarceration rate. 44% of the black men in that, who were born in that county, were incarcerated on a single day in 2010. There's your problem, perhaps, right? Can't make much money in jail. By contrast, if you grew up only a few miles away in Compton, which we've all heard about from the gang movies, the incarceration rate is only 6%. And therefore, your upward mobility is very different. So at least in central LA, there are some issues around incarceration rates, probably to do with gangs, probably to do with other social issues, that aren't showing up in just the pure poverty rates, that are causing serious issues for those people to get ahead in life. But even within Watts, the bad place, the outcomes vary across demographic groups. Only 4% of Hispanics are in jail in the same neighborhood, in the same low-income strata. And black women can make 2 or 3 times as much as black men, even growing up in the same families. So it's disproportionately affecting black men in that neighborhood. And in the 1 minute remaining, I'll just say that this becomes a conversation piece that the policymakers in the Opportunity Lab are able to kind of engage people and say, okay, for this neighborhood, is it education? For this neighborhood, is it nutrition in childhood? For this neighborhood, is it the schools and the education system? And to work on policies that are tailored to things that will actually make a difference. So I'll leave it at that. You can play around with the Opportunity Atlas. There are 200 million data points displayed in this tool. All kinds of stories we've never found ourselves that you might find, but it's lots of fun. Any questions? I must have covered it really well. Right? All right, yes?
Sorry, I just want to say thank you both for the amazing presentations. When I started my career as a geophysicist, as my boss, the first piece of advice he told me is like, I can tell you all these technical things that would be better at your job. But, and this is when PowerPoint was kind of the thing to use, was he said, but PowerPoint is your storefront window. He's like, if you don't interest me, get me interested when I'm walking by, I could care less what you have in the store. And so it's neat to see all these new tools and the visualizations that are being used to hook people in so that they can continue to see what it is you have in your stores. So
that's
these are great talks today.
No, that's a very good point. Thank you. Oh, one more question.
So some of those guidelines that you actually showed about how to make things more clear were just so simple yet so effective. Like I have usually like problems with implementing like clarity in my own design. So like, are there any like resources, any like Bibles for these kind of things that we can just?
Yes. Yeah, I recommend anything by Stephen Few is kind of a great starting point, and then it'll branch out from there. It's F-E-W, Stephen Few. He's probably the most famous. I don't know, Wesley might have some.
I think that he's kind of this sweet spot between academic but also applied, and gives a lot of really specific advice. His books are great. He has a sort of tome. It's Show Me the Numbers, I think, which is a like big sort of tabletop, like a couple 100-page thing. If you're looking for the Bible, that's probably the best one. Yeah. There's also a bunch of other books in work with too. Okay.
Yeah, there's another guy named Gar Reynolds. Less about the specific visuals, but how to do a good PowerPoint presentation, how to string it together, and so forth. Gar Reynolds is another one you might want to look at. So those are two fantastic books to start with. Yeah. All right, Carmen, take it away.
Okay, all right. So in closing then, so we'll see you guys next month. So we'll be doing energy topic next month. So I'm looking for kind of people who are doing cool space within energy. Maybe if you have some ideas on anyone working maybe with sensors or has lots of data in the upstream or working on that kind of thing, that's kind of what I was looking to feature. And then as I mentioned, June, we'll do workplace analytics as our topic. So I'm going to close off. The speakers are definitely staying around for the next 10 minutes if you have any questions for them. And otherwise, please take a sandwich. I don't want to take them back to Edmonton, so I encourage you to take more food and then tell your friends about this meetup. Like, it really is supposed to be a free lunch and learn. That's the idea. Okay, thank you.